Welcome, welcome, welcome to the first panel of Battery Day 2023. So glad to have you all here. So my name is Bianca Goebel and I will be co-moderating with the Avrithi Mystery, and today we are going to bring you the battery market overview of Asia. Asia plays a critical role in the global battery supply chain, providing essential materials and production capacity and technological advancements. We have three experts sharing their Asia battery market knowledge with us today, so let me introduce them to you. First off, we have Rebecca Gordon, and she is the CEO of CRU Consulting. Rebecca joined CRU in 1995 and has more than 25 years experience in leading the metals in the mining and metals industry. So with CRU, Rebecca has gained her first experience in the operational performance improvement in sort of copper and aluminium, and developed CRU's business in South America. After a period of time, moved on to business development for the group, and Rebecca returned to consulting and ran the strategy practice, responding to the impact of the energy transition on commodities before being involved in CRU's acquisition of Exawatt, the consultancy and analysis company focused on global decarbonisation through electrification. And she now serves as director. She holds both an MA and a Masters of Engineering in Production Engineering from Cambridge University and an MBA in IM from IMD in Switzerland. Next, we have Dennis Roman Gallus, who's a senior project manager from Rollenberger and has been in the battery market and technology expert space, working in the field of lithium-ion batteries for more than 10 years. After being at the MEET Battery Research Centre as a PhD student, he started in the consulting profession. He has concluded more than 70 battery-related consulting projects along the whole value chain, from mining to recycling, for many major OEMs, cell producers, battery material producers, and investment banks. His projects encompass due diligence, market entry strategies, raw material and supply chain strategies, and cost technology benchmarking, and more. And last but not least, we have Dev, who comes with 13 years of experience across management consulting at EY in strategy, M&A, and business development roles for the auto OEMs in India, followed by heading the auto, EV, and battery cluster at Invest India, Ministry of Commerce for the Government of India, wherein he was responsible for attracting and facilitating EV and battery sector FDI into India. He has been working with the Indian EV and battery ecosystem since 2017, and he is currently responsible for setting the foundation of C4V in India. And one of his major responsibilities is to build up a venture capital arm for C4V to invest in the Indian climate tech startup ecosystem. So Dev did his MBA, has an MBA, and has been an engineering degree as well. So welcome to all our panelists. Amazing. So let's start by acknowledging that a lot of battery innovation comes out of Asia, and in particular China. So first question for you is, should other regions try and build up local battery R&D capability to rival Asia? Or should maybe we work to support Asia to continue being that epicenter of battery innovation? Who would like to take that first?
I can start with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we see a lot of innovations coming from Asia, especially from China. As Asia already has a long history in battery cell production, they are already putting more efforts also in R&D. For instance, CATL, with more than 17,000 people in R&D, are strongly driving new innovations, whereas new players in North America and also Europe are first focusing on ramp up of their facilities. Nevertheless, on the mid and long term, also those new players need to be innovative as well to keep up with Asian companies, not only from a technology, but also from a cost perspective. So therefore, from my perspective, it's clear that also new players in North America and in Europe need to catch up in terms of R&D capabilities and need to install their own research teams, also located in North America and in Europe. So that's not only important from the innovation perspective, but also in terms of supplying the sufficient capabilities in terms of serious development of their cells, for instance, with major automotive OEMs.
Anybody else want to comment on that one?
Yeah. Perhaps I could add just something there. I think that a lot of the technology that's currently in cars is very, very old. It's not technology that's come to the market recently. It's technology that's evolved. And what we're seeing in China is actually a really fast evolution of existing technology. So the new cell packs for LFP, putting manganese into LFP, changing the ratios for your NMC. That it's not a revolution, it's an evolution that pushes the cost down or pushes up the manufacturing efficiency. But when you're looking at bench scale new technologies, you are actually seeing a lot of universities, a lot of companies outside of Asia beginning to invest in that space. And I think when we start thinking about completely new chemistries, some of the sodium stuff, for example, it might have been patented in Japan, but a lot of the development of sodium is coming outside of China as well as in. So I don't think we can sit back and say, yes, it's happening quicker in Asia. It's happening quicker with the existing technologies in Asia because they have a production base. But for the new stuff, I can see that coming out of European institutions as well as American, as well as Asian. So I think there's a global race that will come with the next generation.
Okay. And Dev, did you have a point to add?
Sure. So I think I, of course, agree with whatever has been said, and definitely a lot of innovation has been happening in the last previous few years, especially in Asia, especially in China, across battery chemistry, not only on the cathode side of things, but also now we have innovations happening on sodium ion. We have activities happening on the manufacturing process. Even the packing efficiencies have been improving across Asia. But where the rest of the world can play a role is potentially alternate chemistries, which are not prevalent in Asia as of now. So for the next few years, in the near to medium term, I don't think so any of the auto OEMs would be willing to qualify any non-traditional battery chemistry. However, if we look at a longer term view, definitely rest of the world has the potential to, during this time frame, develop new chemistries, take them to a giga scale, get them qualified via auto OEMs, and that is where countries can definitely play a role. And exotic chemistries, sodium ions of sorts, and lithium, sulfur, and so on and so forth, solid states.
Absolutely. Thank you. So many of us have read that there's currently a bit of an oversupply of batteries in Asia, especially in China, and that's due to a combination of factors, including a slowdown in the growth rate of EV sales, aggressive expansion of production capacity by Chinese firms aiming to secure government subsidies, and regulations such as the IRA and more. So when it comes to investing in the battery supply chain, should investment dollars be focused to go into Asia? Or maybe should Asia be looking to leverage their sort of active material cell module pack expertise to successfully invest in building the battery supply chain outside of Asia? What are your thoughts on this? You're just on mute, Dennis.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so sure. I mean, there are a lot of investment opportunities outside of China, due to the fact that in North America and also Europe is looking for located supply chains. In the US, it becomes more and more difficult for a Chinese player through exclusion through the IRA, but there are business models like with Ford and CATL. So there are opportunities also to produce in North America. But we currently see very strong activities of Chinese companies in Europe. So since the IRA was announced, there is a plus of 60% of cell production announcements in Europe by Chinese companies, whereas the announcements of local players remained at the same level. So there are definitely opportunities, especially in Europe. And that's not only true for cell production, but especially also for the other materials, because we already see also many announcements in Europe, for instance, for cell production, but especially for active materials, cathode active material, anode materials, there are definitely additional investment opportunities. And we are also supporting Chinese clients and other Asian clients to find the right location and the right strategy in order to build up the business in Europe. So therefore, we are definitely also observing that there are strong activities already from Chinese players looking into other markets.
Yeah, it's interesting actually that you see the Koreans, particularly in the US now, so very strong Korean investment in the US, and then the Chinese moving over to Europe. I think on your question of oversupply, I'm not sure there can be oversupply when we haven't yet built out the grid level storage volumes that we need. So very, very focused on electric vehicles at the moment. But until we can get the grid up, and I think we'll come back to that particularly when we talk about India and a lot of other regions, until you can get grid storage to enable renewables and get that fully allowed in the production volumes, it's unlikely that overcapacity will remain. I also think that localization of production is going to be really important as the recycling picks up. This material has to be recycled. It's inherently high value, and you can't transport used batteries very far. So we will need plants to make reprocessed cathode active material and cells in local region. So I don't think there is a business model that reverts everything back to China or Korea every time. It would have to be localized.
Absolutely. And I think, Dev, you were saying you'd seen some Asian players investing in other regions as well.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is post the IRA, since the IRA says that, even though Chinese companies are sort of prohibited to invest into the US, however, any country which has an FTA with the US, those countries are free to supply and to get the incentives from IRA. So what's been happening is Chinese companies of late have been investing into South Korea, given FTA between South Korea and the US. So of late, POSCO has, for example, partnered with CNGR, I think, for nickel refining and some precursor manufacturing. EcoPro from South Korea is again partnering with a Chinese company known as Green Eco for battery precursors. Then a couple of more Chinese companies are investing into Korea across refining, across precursors, across cathode materials. So South Korea has sort of been gaining some ground with respect to Chinese investments to participate into the IRA incentives. How will all of this play eventually? We don't know yet, but it seems to be a way which Chinese companies have found out to have some play within the IRA incentives.
Absolutely. And just launching off that mention of India by yourself, Rebecca, just this year, India became the third largest car market in the world, overtaking countries like Germany. Dev, what does this mean for investment opportunities aimed at India's growing EV demand?
So I think Indian market is definitely growing very, very fast in the last 5 years, I would say. Specifically from an electric vehicle segment perspective, it has grown by 8x since 2018. We recently touched 2022 year, we touched 1 million electric vehicles. This year, as of today, we have already sold 1.4 million EVs, currently doing about 5% market penetration, which is sort of a tipping point beyond which what we have seen globally is once a country hits a 5% market penetration mark, there is exponential growth thereafter from 5 to 25% potentially in the next 4 years. So this is the stage at which we are in the Indian market. However, the market is very, very unique in the sense, like most of the Asian markets, it's predominantly two-wheelers and three-wheelers, light form factor vehicles. So and this is the space where action is happening, most of the action. And almost every day we hear news of either a new player entering the Indian market or capex plans, product launches. From a global investment perspective, We have Gogoro from Taiwan recently investing in the process of investing about $1 billion in India. Foxconn is making India as their EV manufacturing hub. VinFast and Tesla are taking some office spaces in India, starting their hiring plans to primarily do vehicle assembly in step one, then vehicle manufacturing, eventually a gigafactory. From a battery standpoint, more specifically, we have players like S-Volt who have entered in India with a technology licensing arrangement. We have players like Faradion on sodium ion side, Lithium Works from the US on LFP side. A few Indian companies have already invested into tech companies like Ola from India has recently invested into StoreDot, which is Israeli fast charging battery tech company. So I think a lot of action is happening across investments, product launches, policies I didn't touch upon, but significant policy incentives in the Indian market as of today for both EV and battery players. So definitely action is happening. We are at that tipping point, which investors understand that from here on, it's no looking back. It's no longer a question of if, but rather a question of how long will those investments start to yield better returns. So I think we are at that stage right now. Definitely a lot of traction is happening.
Absolutely. And, you're in the VC space. How's the VC space helping the battery industry grow either in India or more broadly across Asia?
I think this space is growing globally exponentially fast. If we talk about the VC space in particular, last year we touched $70 billion globally, invested into the broader climate tech space. Of this 70 billion, 30% of this went into storage, as far as I can remember. And of this 21 billion within the storage space globally, lion's share of this went into the battery space. So definitely a lot of traction is happening. Last year itself, we saw 30 plus companies becoming unicorns within the climate tech space. From a VC perspective, this sector has grown 40x in the last 8 to 10 years. What's interesting is China used to lead from a VC sector perspective, from a climate tech sector perspective. China used to lead most of these investments until about 2 years back, but now it's the US which has again taken the throne position, and it's sort of leading investments from a private markets perspective. And another interesting insight here is that of late, last few years, lots of corporates have started their CVCs within the climate tech space, within the battery tech space, and a lot of startup founders are actually interested to take more capital from CVCs vis-a-vis other funds, even though CVCs, if we look at the data, even though CVCs are asking for 1 to 2% more dilution from these startups, even then these startups are preferring a strategic over a incumbent fund from that perspective. So definitely action is happening in the Indian context. We have seen about $1.6 billion being invested in the last 12 months across EVs plus batteries. And most of this, I would say, is going into, it used to be an even split of upstream, midstream, downstream, but now focus is more towards upstream and midstream companies. Basically, innovations happening more around refining capabilities, extraction capabilities, recycling companies, some bit of alternate battery chemistries. These are the areas which are attracting more and more of venture capital investments vis-a-vis, I would say, cell manufacturing or downstream side of battery packs and thermal management and so on and so forth.
Noted.
So definitely an exciting space to be in.
So we definitely know there's lots of opportunity in Asia when it comes to batteries, but also I'd love to ask, are there any headwinds that we should be wary of when we're thinking about continued EV and BESS growth in the Asian battery market?
I mean, I have to come back to that grid question. I think that's an interesting one to put to Dev, actually. If all the VC funding is focused in the actual cars and the car supply chain, is it possible for venture capital to come into the grid scale? Because obviously these things all have to be plugged in, even if they're 2 and 3 wheeler. And I think that's, particularly in Asia, that's a huge challenge. And you've got a strong base of coal-fired power as well, which doesn't necessarily make these very green.
Absolutely, Rebecca. Good point. So not specifically talking about the grid, but from an application perspective, in the last, I would say, 12 to 18 months, at least in the Indian context, most of the VC capital has not come into the upstream supply chain. However, most of that capital has gone into the end application, which could be a 2-wheeler OEM or 3-wheeler OEM or a vehicle manufacturing or a larger vehicle manufacturing OEM person, which is doing some sort of innovation. And now that capital is given the localization push of various countries, given the scale which we are now starting to see on the adoption side, It's now that we see investors are looking at more at the supply chain opportunities, because this is where most of the value resides, most of the technology resides. So now capital has started to come into supply chain, technology, components, powertrains, batteries, and so on and so forth. All of this has started to happen now. But until now, it was all about the end application of batteries for most of that capital.
So I think from my side, the risk to this whole rollout, the headwinds are around the grid. So do we have enough copper, aluminium to build out the networks? Do we have enough polysilicon? Do we have enough rare earths to build out renewable supply? Which part of the chain needs investment at which point to enable the full growth of the system? Because obviously firing electric vehicles off coal-fired power plants is not the end goal. It may be the intermediate point, but in the long term, we need to come up with some other solutions.
Yep. Okay, and on that note, if we're heading up the supply chain to sort of mining of critical battery commodities, Indonesia is a country of note because of its nickel and copper deposits. What's interesting about the role Indonesia can play in this growing battery supply chain?
Yeah, so on one hand, around 25% of the global resources for nickel are located in Indonesia. So therefore, that's number one, why this is an important and interesting opportunity. And I mean, not only the Chinese companies, but also the cell players and cathode active material players in Europe, and also some from North America are already looking for investment opportunities in Indonesia. So cost advantages in order to decouple the metal price from the global stock market can be especially achieved when locating a bigger part of the supply chain, also as co-located PCAM production next to the nickel mines and refineries, also at the similar location, and also the same production. So therefore, cost advantages can be leveraged, and that's especially an interesting opportunity in Indonesia. I mean, for China, it's anyway interesting due to close proximity. But as mentioned, also European players are looking for co-located PCAM hubs directly in Indonesia.
I think also in Indonesia, they've been very nimble. They've picked up new technologies where perhaps other countries have been a bit slower. They've been quite fast to adapt. They've got a very fast cycle time for building new capacity. They take Chinese technology, Chinese money, make decisions and investments very quickly. So I think it's also been a speed of response. I mean, they do naturally have a resource that no one else has, but they've exploited that to the full through the speed with which they've invested.
So, as previously mentioned, one thing that's unique to Asia is the heavy use of 2- and 3-wheel vehicles, and that's not something we necessarily see in other regions of the world. Are regional differences like this translating into sort of unique battery products or battery business models that are specific to the Asia region?
Yeah, I mean, you already mentioned it. So there is a larger market share of smaller entry vehicles and 2- and 3-wheelers. And this also enables the application for battery cell chemistries which have lower energy densities. Especially, we see a stronger demand, or we expect a stronger demand, not only of LFP, but also of sodium-ion batteries in Asia compared to other regions worldwide. And therefore, we also see from the production side for sodium-ion batteries, for instance, in China, already more than 120 gigawatt-hour announcements. So that's also very strongly driven by Asia and China, and might also be transferred to other regions. But there are, let's say, the strongest activities, and that's really caused by the larger portion of vehicles with lower distances is driven in Asia and China. So that's one point. And we also see other business models which are evolving, especially in China, like battery swapping. So that's strongly driven there. But we also see that there is some adoption, for instance, NIO, which is already also installing those battery swapping installations also in Europe. So therefore, that's often the case that we see currently a technology evolving in China, and then it's also transferred to other regions.
In fact, picking up from your point, Dennis, on battery swapping, I think swapping is not only a phenomenon which has started in China, but now it's been spreading its wings across Asia, given the similar sort of vehicle form factors what we have around Asia, countries like Indonesia, Thailand, India for that matter. So, I mean, swapping is working very, very well for all the stakeholders across the value chain, right from vehicle OEMs, which earlier used to make money only at the time of sale, but now, given that their service revenue would be reduced to quite an extent with lesser number of parts in an electric vehicle, swapping plays a role there. What's been happening is with every battery swap a vehicle does, some share of that revenue from the swapping operator goes to the vehicle OEM. So vehicle OEMs, to some extent, like swapping phenomena from that perspective. Governments like it because it's very, very efficient when it comes to real estate. Most of these big cities across Asia are with larger population are actually crunched for land. So it's very efficient from a land use perspective, and then from a commercial use case perspective, it's very predominant in a B2B space. Players doing e-commerce deliveries, grocery deliveries, food deliveries, logistics, fleet operations. Most of these delivery people are very, very cost conscious. Most of these people want to ride their vehicle as much as they can every day, because every kilometer they ride, they make some revenue is directly linked with every kilometer they ride, right? So they don't want their vehicle to get stuck at a charging station for 4 hours, 5 hours on a daily basis, not generating any revenue for them. So a 1 minute swap, 2 minute swap definitely adds a lot of value to these end users who are cost conscious. With swapping, what's happening is battery cost is primarily separated from the vehicle, which means vehicle becomes much cheaper to acquire, and you actually are paying for swapping either on a subscription model or on a monthly basis, annual basis, or maybe pay per use, whatever works. But it's basically working for all the stakeholders in a great way. And companies like, at least in the Asian context, companies like Gogoro and Honda have been investing actively across Asia, Taiwan, Indonesia, India, again, more from a swapping perspective. The only challenge which I see in this space, at least in the Indian context, is that governments primarily want to give flexibility to the end users. For instance, if I today take my vehicle to fill gasoline, I'm free to go to any pump, any station, get gasoline, move on. So from a swapping perspective, also governments in different countries, at least in India, want to focus on standardization, want to focus on flexibility for the end consumer, which might not go well with the industry, because if we standardize the battery form factors, if we standardize the communication protocols, connectors to some extent, then it's a industry in a niche. It's an industry in a very initial stage right now. Innovation is happening. Standardizing it might or might not be the right thing to do. So this is the flux wherein we are at. And even if you look at the US market, not necessarily from a swapping perspective, but more from a standard perspective, until about a few months back, US government's official standard was CCS. But what happened eventually, market chose NACS from Tesla, right? Almost all the OEMs are moving towards that. So standardization much before time doesn't actually hit the market. So this is the flux wherein we are. So, but having said this, swapping is definitely working well for countries which have light form factor vehicles, which have lighter batteries in turn, which are easy to swap, which don't need robotic arms, automation in those swapping stations, which are very, very capital intensive. So it's working well. The only thing which these swapping companies need to, I think about the success factors rather for these swapping companies would be things like building a dense swap station. Because if you have to give a 2 minute swap to these riders, you need to have a dense station which gives these riders, these OEMs, comfort that swapping would not be a challenge. And setting up this dense network of swapping station at every kilometer, every 2 kilometers is a very, very capital intensive thing to do. So you need deep pockets. Second is very close-knit partnerships with vehicle OEMs, energy companies, real estate providers, because eventually, as a swapping player, you need your asset to be utilized. You need your swapping station to be utilized for you to make money. It will be utilized only if more and more vehicles come to you for swap, which will only happen if you have partnered with more and more number of vehicle OEMs who in turn are using your battery packs, who in turn are swapping their batteries at your stations. So those kind of partnerships, strong partnerships are super important for success. And lastly, I would say partnerships, inventory. Because end of the day, as a swapping station provider, what's important is how much inventory you hold. Typically, it's 50 to 100% more than the number of vehicles which come to your station to swap batteries. Because at every point in time, some batteries would be getting charged in the background, and some batteries would be available at the swap station. And batteries are expensive from a capex standpoint. We all know that. So how efficiently using AI ML sort of tools, how efficiently you're able to minimize your inventory so as to have a lesser number of battery packs in the background, and that will basically make your business more commercially viable. So these are some success factors which I think differentiate companies like a Gogoro vis-a-vis their other counterparts in different parts of Asia. But it's definitely picking up very, very well.
You can see that being a bit of a technology race, can't you, against the fast charging? So I think if you can get the fast charging down to a matter of minutes, the capital invested in battery swapping might be less worthwhile. So I see it as a bit of a tech race between the two.
Absolutely.
And eventually maybe both of them coexist. You never know. I mean, a point taken, absolutely right. But end of the day, different use cases and different both of these technology could actually coexist for different applications in different countries and so on and so forth.
And the swapping can cope with a weaker grid, whereas the flash charging actually needs quite a strong grid.
Correct.
Exactly. Another example for that is positive for swapping is that, you know, you can allow batteries to be in one place, which helps for recycling. It also allows for regular BMS, like battery health testing, in a systematic and controlled way. But yes, there are also drawbacks, so it's very case dependent. Well, we're going to move on to some questions from the audience. So if we just bring up my co-moderator, Avrithi, and she'll walk you through a few
Thanks,
of these.
Priyanka. We have a question from Nathan around Indonesia and how the industry deals with Indonesia's poor ESG records, given we want ethically sourced battery minerals and materials.
I mean, I can have a go. At the moment, I think there's a focus on production ramp up in Indonesia. And there are three core challenges that we see in Indonesia with ESG. So you've got a loss of biodiversity because you're taking quite a lot of land that previously wasn't developed and developing that into mine space. That also leads to deforestation. And I think with the mine rehabilitation, you can get quite a reduction in soil fertility as well. On top of that, you've got the tailings disposal that they're facing, and also the use of coal-fired power to push these assets on. I think on the other side of those challenges, that as actually Dennis said, there aren't many other choices around the world for new nickel supply. There aren't any new sulfide deposits. And you're very much focused on Indonesia or Philippines, which faces exactly the same challenges if you want to ramp up laterite supply. So while it's obviously very much suboptimal to do anything detrimental to the environment, if people do want nickel NMC batteries, at the moment, this is the source we're looking at. And we're also ramping up our demand for stainless steel and our demand for superalloys, which also draw on that same nickel resource. So even without the batteries, you could see those assets being developed in Indonesia, perhaps a little slower. But I think it's a challenge for all of us to look at global nickel supply. I think Elon Musk mentioned it before. It's very hard to find a green solution for nickel. And that might be a reason why it's substituted out of future battery chemistries, because it's going to be very, very difficult for the industry as a whole to make completely green nickel.
And on the topic of,
Maybe one thing to add from an European perspective, with upcoming EU regulations also on supply chain due diligences, it becomes more and more important to comply with those requirements. So therefore, all players across the value chain need to look into that. And therefore, it's also in the interest of the OEMs and of the cell producers that those mines which are operated also in Indonesia comply with specific requirements also regarding ESG. So therefore, there will be also some pressure from the buyer side.
Yeah, but there aren't many other alternatives that are they're a bit greener, but they're not fully green. So you can't go out somewhere else in the world and find the nirvana solution of a green nickel. There's plenty of work to be done by all the players to get closer and closer to what we should be able to achieve in the long term.
Yeah. On a similar note, there was a question around how panelists see Indonesia collaborating with the IRA. Any thoughts?
I mean, you're definitely seeing inward investment into Indonesia precisely because of the IRA. There isn't much in the way of nickel resource in USA. I mean, they're able to pull some from Canada. There's investments going into Brazil. Brazil's again a laterite zone. But to be honest with you, the volume and the low capital costs come in Indonesia. So the IRA is probably pushing investment into Indonesia.
We do actually have one more question from earlier around the Chinese market. Question from Tama: how do the panelists see the potential consolidations in the broader Chinese market regarding active material and battery production?
I guess I can have a go again. It's a volume game. I mean, car making has always been a volume game. So you want big capacity for the efficiencies you need, and then you need to trade that off against the recycling where you've got a slightly more local business. So for now, you're that race to the low cost comes with large scale manufacturing. So you have to see consolidation. So the weak will drop out and the strong will get bigger.
Yes, Rebecca, you're absolutely right. So it's a volume game, and also related to that, the large players are capable of investing up to the mining business. And I think that's the biggest lever, to be invested across the whole value chain, not only in the active materials, but up to the mines to enable the lowest cost. And those players who are capable of doing these invests across the value chain will win the game at the end.
Yeah, and you're seeing that already. You're seeing the cell makers really reaching back into that mining space, despite the fact them being completely different businesses, to help them source the cheap and the guaranteed supply at a quality you know about, because it is quite fickle, the battery making industry, in terms of the quality. It's not as simple as everyone thought originally. So guaranteed supply of a known quality is also highly valuable.
Great, thank you. Shall we move on to the poll results? So panelists, we asked our audience on LinkedIn what you consider to be the biggest challenges facing the battery market in Asia today. And these were the results. Do you have any thoughts or comments?
I think I would agree with this, that supply chain disruptions definitely, in my opinion, is one of the largest challenge which the industry is facing today, especially as Dennis mentioned, most of the auto OEMs eventually, until we have timely upstream investments across refining all the level until mining, it's very hard for these downstream investments of vehicle manufacturing to actually get their feedstock, because these upstream companies, upstream investments actually take a much longer time, much longer gestation period for these investments to fructify and start yielding output. So supply chain is something which has to be secured sooner than later. And some OEMs have already started to make these investments to vertically integrate themselves. However, still a long way to go. And then R&D, of course, R&D across alternate chemistries, to be precise, is something which different countries can definitely do a lot of work on, because these alternate chemistries could become potentially very relevant, qualified across auto OEMs in the next 5 to 8 years or thereafter. So these two areas definitely are a big challenge right now, but come with a lot of opportunities also.
Yeah, I'd pick on supply chain disruptions as well. Actually, I think not necessarily just disruption, but also the fact that it's taking longer and longer to get through permitting and development of new mines. And that's because obviously the environmental regulations are getting stricter. Absolutely, they should be. But they're also getting more complex at almost the same rate. And if we need new volume and we need it quickly, we need a simplicity around environmental regulations, around the hurdles people need to go through. Because a lot of the miners coming in, it adds a couple of years to the development process, and you need it to move faster than that. So absolutely key to comply with environmental regulations, but make it simpler.
And with that, we have come to the end of the first panel for Battery Day 2023. Looking at the Asian battery market, we've learnt about sort of the headwinds that are potential challenges that we need to work on across the region, but also the tailwinds and the great growth that is expected to continue coming from this powerhouse of the battery industry globally. So a big thank you to all our panelists for your insights and inputs today. And for the audience, we'll have a short break before we head straight on into battery panel 2, where we'll be looking specifically at BESS, battery energy stationary storage. Thank you, everyone.